A variety of tools for letting you analyze data. If you're working with database type lists, there's probably no greater tool than what's called a pivot table. Think of a pivot table as a separate entity that we're about to create. We've got a list of data here. It shows information about various sales. We're seeing the salesperson, the product, where the region occurs, where the product's being sold, the customer who's buying the product, and so on. It covers a 2-year period, 2011 and 2012. We want to make some sense out of this data. You might be familiar with a lot of other database tools like sorting and filtering, subtotals. And although the subtotals feature does give you some tabulating capability, the other features are primarily designed to rearrange the data and display it in different ways. We want some good, quick summary information out of this list. And suppose you're thinking to yourself, I'd like to see a list showing each salesperson and the products that each salesperson has sold. How many of these has each person sold? Could we tabulate that information relatively quickly here? Well, maybe by sorting, using subtotals. There's no immediate solution that comes to mind. Off to the right in the same worksheet, I'm going to scroll to the right. I've done this manually. In other words, we're showing in this list all of our salespersons, and we're focused on the items that we're looking at here, the items that occur within our list, and how many items each person has sold. Altogether, nearly 8,000 items. Now, how do we come up with a list like this? This is not the easiest function to use. Some ifs, plural, recognize what it's doing. It's a powerful tool to be sure. How long would it take you to set this up? Even if you're an experienced Excel user, it's going to take some time. You'll make some mistakes along the way. It's not easy to create. And let me make column I narrower so we can see this closer to our data, and scroll leftward a bit here. Not only might we want to see a list like this, we might also want to see a list that shows the salespersons by region. Or maybe instead of the salespersons here, how about the customers? Which products are they buying? How easy would it be to adjust a list like this? Not very easy. With a pivot table, we could create a list like this in about 5 or 10 seconds. And furthermore, we wouldn't need to deal with formulas like the kind we're seeing here. In fact, we won't need to deal with formulas at all, depending on what it is we do. And we're going to come up with the same answers. We're going to get 7997 for our total. So let's do it. Let's create a pivot table. A couple of prerequisites. The data you're working with is very similar to the kinds of data that you would work with if you sort data or work with filtering or subtotals. Everything will work more smoothly and easier if the list that you begin with has no empty rows or columns. And so the idea that a pivot table, which is a great analytical tool, can be thrown at almost any data isn't quite right. You have to have a structured list for a pivot table to be able to use that list. Make sure your titles are in a single row. That makes everything a lot easier as well. Unique entries. No empty rows within the list, no empty columns. Here and there you might have empty cells. This list doesn't, but in some cases you will see empty cells, and that's just fine. When you create a pivot table, the default location will be on a new worksheet, but you can also place it if you prefer on the current worksheet. Let's say we're going to go with the default. We want to create a pivot table. Even though this feature is designed to work with database-like data, and it does pull together some of the better features of sorting and filtering and subtotals, it's not found on the Data tab. It's found on the Insert tab. You see the button over on the left-hand side. The active cell is within our list. We click Pivot Table, and the Create Pivot Table dialog box pops up. A quick look at whether Excel has figured out the extent of your data. It has in this case, all the way down to row 913 here. The default location for the pivot table will be on a new worksheet. Let's just go with that so we don't have to change anything here. And very often when you create a pivot table, you simply want to make a quick glance to make sure Excel has picked up your data properly. And if you want it on a new sheet, simply click OK. So watch the bottom of our screen where we see the sheet names. Now we see a sheet 1. And on this sheet 1, over on the left-hand side, we see a placeholder for the pivot table. And off to the right, we see pivot table fields. You can move this list. Let's drag it into worksheet environment, possibly make it a little bit larger. The upper portion of this list, and you can move this split line up and down as needed, or scroll, contains a list of all the field names that we just saw. The portion below this becomes increasingly important. Think of it as a map of the pivot table. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense just yet. But if we click the box for salesperson, remember we want to see salesperson down the left-hand side of our table. We now see that over in column A. That's an alphabetized list of our salespersons. And in the lower portion of this pivot table fields dialog box, we do see salesperson listed. We might want to show the dollar volume or perhaps the number of items sold. So let's click number of items. Because that's a numeric field, if we check this box, it will automatically appear in what's referred to as the values area. But perhaps more important, in the pivot table that we see being built to the left, we see the sum of the items, 7,997. That's what we saw earlier. The third step here is different than the other two. We want the word product to appear across the top. So we drag this into an area called columns. And there's our pivot table. Now this is the exact list that we saw before. There are no formulas anywhere. We go back to the original data on the creating sheet. That manually created table to the right contains the same information that we just saw by way of a pivot table. 7,997 total. There's Harlan Vaughn here with 1,068 total. And the others, we see too. Going back to sheet 1 where our pivot table is, we see those exact same numbers. So here's our first look at a pivot table. Easy to create, gives us the information we need. Would you display this in a presentation? Perhaps. There are some terms here you might want to change. Recognize this idea too. The active cell is currently within the pivot table. You may have seen, and you can see now, there is a pivot table tools ribbon with an Analyze tab and a Design tab on it. And also we have our pivot table fields list to the right. If you click outside the pivot table, as I'm about to do, pivot table field list to the right disappears, and the ribbon resumes its normal look. We don't see those special tabs. Click back within the pivot table, we see them. If you were making a presentation, the terms column labels and row labels probably don't mean that much to anybody else. You might want to get rid of them. If you're just working with this yourself, I'd say maybe leave them there for a while. It gets you familiar with the terminology. This term matches up with the pivot table field list to the right. The columns area refers to the data across the top of a pivot table, which you don't always have, but you usually do. And the row labels refer to the area down the left-hand side. So we see these 4 sections over here, 3 of which we're using. The numerical entry, the actual values here, this is referred to as the values area, and we see that over here too. So you get used to using this portion of the pivot table field list as a mapping of your actual pivot table. If you don't want to see the term column labels and row labels, you could make the case for saying, well, it's pretty obvious what's being represented here. Let's not see them at all. So one option would be go to the Analyze tab in the Pivot Table Tools ribbon, and off to the right, don't show field headers. Another option, perhaps better, is leave these here, and then go to the Design tab and choose Report Layout. Now, unfortunately, the terms here don't exactly shout out as to what they mean, but we are currently using the so-called compact form. If you use outline or tabular, then we're going to see the field names instead of the terms row labels and column labels. So product and salesperson, probably more meaningful to most people. So it's a great tool for analyzing data, and we see in the initial stages here how you can create this in just a few steps.
A membership to lynda.com unlocks this entire course and hundreds of others. Visit lynda.com to learn more.